Welcome to Show Studio. It's our first roundup of the day and we're going to be unpicking everything that happened at Milan Fashion Week. I just got a crisis flash there. I was like, are we doing Milan? We are, we're doing Milan. We're talking about what's going on there. And it's a really interesting time for Milan, which is not something that can always be said. Often when we do these roundup discussions, people sit here and they say that, Milan was a bit flat or you don't get many surprises. But this season I feel that there was a lot of there was change in the air, but there was also really exciting things on the runways. But before we kind of delve in and start discussing the highs and lows, I'll let my wonderful set of panellists introduce themselves, starting with you, Hilary.
My name's Hilary Alexander and I'm a freelance fashion writer.
I'm Victoria Moss and I'm currently the fashion features editor at The Telegraph magazine.
I'm Alex Fiore. I'm the fashion editor and critic at The Independent and I newspapers.
I'm Harriet Quick, I'm an editor and journalist.
So I want to start by asking what everyone's highlight from Milan was, and maybe I'm putting words in people's mouths, but I presume it'll probably be Gucci because that's where there was a lot of change. What stood out, Harriet? What struck your fancy?
Gucci did, because it was just such a radical change. Although actually the clothes aren't that radically different to maybe what is the offer.
Yeah.
Chiffon blouses and beautiful trousers, etc. I loved Prada's kind of chromatic odyssey.
Yeah.
And Bottega Veneta for its luxuriousness. And that hint, and that sort of sense of naivety that kind of ran through a lot of collections, I think was really appealing.
That's interesting. Tell me more about that. You say a sense of naivety.
Well, I think you associate with Milan that very strident, polished, powerful kind of, uber packaged kind of fashion image and product, and I think there was that sense of awkwardness in the Gucci show, and it ran through some other collections which kind of just gave it a more poetic tilt. There was more room for interpretation rather than this sort of 150% polished, impenetrable glamazon image.
And we're seeing a lot of people nodding there. Does everyone agree with that? Other people interpret that sense of naivety.
Also, and Harriet mentioned poetic, which I think came through in many collections, particularly in Alberta Ferretti, which at times sort of was, well, you could pick anywhere, sort of a Nordic winter wonderland, a bit of Romeo and Juliet, a bit of Heidi, a bit of Cossack, but it was done with, quite a soft touch. I thought it was, really, really gentle and pretty, but a nice way to do folklore without it becoming too sort of fancy dress.
Victoria, what were your highlights?
I think Prada I loved. I always love Prada. It's kind of a bit of a no-brainer, I suppose. But the colours I thought were really beautiful. And it sort of had that kind of kitschness to it, but it wasn't too sugary or saccharine. It sort of looked quite cool, and the coloured tweeds I really liked. Gucci, I sort of half liked it and was half a bit sort of, because it was a little bit derivative of other things. It was a bit Prada and it was a bit sort of Saint Laurent, and I think it'll be interesting to see what he does after that.
Let's delve into Gucci a bit more, because as you say here, and obviously there's a new creative director there. It was the first season for Alessandro Michele to show a women's wear. He had shown a menswear collection, but that was slightly an odd arrangement when it was shown, because he hadn't formally been announced as the new creative director, and that collection was a little bit. There was just a lot of discussion surrounding it. There were talks that it was done in sort of 5 days after Frieda Giannini had moved on, and it was a bit up in the air. Whereas this was a lot more, we knew that it was his appointment, and we were expecting a collection from him, and I thought it was really, really beautiful and very, very different. It's interesting because the advertising campaign came out this morning. I don't know if everyone saw it, by Glenn Luchford, which is it continues that awkwardness that you talked about, and I think
geeky too.
Yeah, very geeky, and I think it's much more sensual rather than sort of sexy, which I think is interesting for Gucci. Alex, what was your take on it? You're staying very quiet.
I liked it. I think perhaps more what it represented. I liked the clothes, but I think the importance of it was the change that it represented. The fact that it's a break, not a break with Frieda Giannini, but it's actually a break with Tom Ford. There was a very marked break in the presentation of the collection. They're actually moving showroom, which means nothing to anyone outside of fashion, but I think to everyone in fashion, the fact they're moving away from the showroom that they've presented in for so long is quite significant. And it was very much about this collection being kind of a catalyst for change. They're now going to change the decor in the shops. They're presenting they're doing their first ever resort catwalk show. I think really what this collection was about was trying to do something new. I thought it was quite brave.
Yeah,
I really think they went into it full throttle, and I think that's motivated by the economics of the situation, by the fact that Gucci's profits flatlined, then started to decline, and Gucci is 60% of Kering Group's revenue. So they had to do something. Absolutely. And I think it's interesting to see how bold they are, but at the same time they could try and do something very commercial, but they're not. They're actually trying to couple those commercial demands with something creative and giving a designer license to put a new stamp on an existing label. So I think it's very brave, and I think that's what I took away from it, that it was very a brave, bold thing to do.
I think that notion of coupling is particularly interesting when you look at it, and I think you said a designer license, and I think that's the thing. I think for a while Gucci, it almost felt like it sat outside of the fashion conversation. It was a show that everyone went to, and you had to go there because it was a big advertiser, and obviously it was a big important part of your Milan schedule, but it didn't feel like it was contributing to a discussion about fashion, whereas this very much does, I think, even though there are those very commercial elements.
I wonder who did the styling, because there are times, looking through now, I keep on getting flashes of Marc Jacobs and Marc by Marc Jacobs, just in the accessorising. And
it was the team that did the styling. It was Michele and the team, because they did the men's as well.
Yeah.
But I think also looking at this, looking at that menswear collection in in comparison to this, you can see that this is a much more assured effort. That menswear collection was an interim. Nothing had been announced. Michele was leading the team, but it was very much a team effort.
But I don't think it felt like an interim in the sense of, I think it would have been so easy to have done, for them to have done a collection of suits, just put out a very commercial collection that was just happened. But they did. It was an interim collection, obviously, right, because they haven't announced someone sort of very practically speaking. But I felt like there was many ideas, and it was as brave as this one, I thought.
I don't think there were as many ideas, because I think that the time restraints meant that there just weren't time,
But I think the ideas
things
had already
didn't
been
arrive. It wasn't. It was done in a very, very short period of time. It was done in about a week. But
I felt like a lot of the ideas in this, when you say there wasn't time for the ideas, I think the reason I really liked it, and maybe it's just my interpretation, is it felt like things they'd always, because it isn't, a team that worked at, Alessandro Michele's worked under Frida Giannini, it's not like it's a new appointment. I felt like it was ideas that they'd always wanted to explore that they finally could. So it didn't feel like it was like they'd been like, oh, what can we do for this collection? Sat and thought. It felt like these are suggestions and things that they'd been thinking about and moods that they'd had for years, perhaps, and then finally had a chance to realise. That was just how I read it. I think that's perhaps why people, because there was a lot of criticism of the men's, that it was, not a lot of criticism, people pointed out that it was a little bit haphazard, and I wondered if that perhaps was because of that, because it was this joyfulness of finally having a platform for certain.
But I think that's nice, because it's not one sort of particular look, or image of a woman that is going down the catwalk. There's so many different sort of personalities, if you like, that I think that makes it much more appealing to the customer.
You need diversity.
Yeah. I think it's interesting what Alex said about Tom Ford, because I think there is one look in there. It's the one worn by Molly Blair. It's right at the top. It's the blue, like a pussy bow brows and trousers, which is just it's a direct, that one there, which is a direct, the trousers are much more bluey when you actually see them. They don't come across very well on screen, which is a direct copy of a Tom Ford look, but done in a very, very different way. It's not as sensual, it's not as kind of tight-fitting, it's buttoned up.
I don't think it's a copy, it's a reference.
Yeah, a reference.
It's a very obvious reference.
Yeah, but then it's interesting because you said he was breaking with Tom Ford. Do you not think there's elements of kind of...
I think there's an acknowledgement. I think that's an acknowledgement of the history. It was a very sly acknowledgement of the history. But I'm talking much more about the fact that this isn't that kind of hyper-sexualised Gucci woman. And a few people, I think, had issue with that. They were being like, oh, what's here for the Gucci customer? Like, well, I think the whole idea is they want a different Gucci customer. They want a new Gucci customer because the Gucci customer isn't buying Gucci anymore. Yeah. Like, she's gone somewhere else. It is very much motivated by those kind of economic demands. But I think as well, it's about trying to do something new, which is, as you said at the start, it was an exciting Milan Fashion Week because I think that we saw people genuinely trying to do things that were new and genuinely trying to shake up the status quo, which you don't normally see in Milan. That's not what Milan's known for. It's known for being safe, and I think it almost felt like it was a reaction to the whole kind of economic situation, a reaction to the kind of drop in profits at a number of different fashion houses. The fact that it has to react and do something different to kind of ignite interest again. And Saint Laurent's come up, and I think actually this is very interesting because the approach of this collection is very much the approach of Eddie Slimane Saint Laurent, which is that idea of eradicating the old and putting a new stamp on something. You know, totally getting rid of what's gone before and creating something as new, and the only thing that remains is the brand name. The fact that they're going ahead and, you know, they've changed the entire way that the show is presented, which has been presented the same way for so long. The fact they've gone ahead and they're changing all the boutiques. It's very much that same approach.
It's interesting as well that actually there's very few, for a company that has 80% of its sales through accessories.
Yeah, there's not much.
There's
there.
only one bag on show. It's very, you know, unladen in that way.
I
Which
think
again is another kind of, let's change the perspective.
Yeah.
But I think as well it's a very distinct proposal of a bag. The other thing that I found very interesting was that under the previous CEO, they tried to get rid of the Gucci logoed products to completely cut out that bottom entry level. They've reintroduced that, and the only bag they showed in the show was Gucci logo prints.
And there was a
Tried
lot
to get
of
rid of it for
There's
2
a lot
years.
of the on the belts and there's a lot of the G's kind of in a subtle way.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting, it's interesting, Alex, that you mentioned that the Saint Laurent kind of model, because one thing that I thought was interesting is it's impossible to see it on the catwalk, but if you looked at the kind of backstage images and the close-ups, there's so much kind of jewellery that all the models are wearing tons and tons of rings, and I imagine some of them are very expensive, but I imagine a lot of them will become kind of those entry-level like bitty products that people can buy into to them, which is Saint Laurent have been so successful with, you know, all those little, and I guess Loewe under JW Anderson as well, with those kind of like just like stuff that you
But I
can
think
buy.
even just showing a Gucci logo handbag and then there being Gucci logo wallets that you can buy, it's giving those kind of a fresh desirability.
Exactly.
To a product, and in a sense, it's a product that they've been trying to get rid of for 2 years. So there is a fresh desirability because it's something you've not seen for a while.
But I also think expanding that repertoire of small items is so important to a house. Now, if you can do those items in a way that feels part of your aesthetic and very well done, I think you do very well because of that. I think that's part of the Loewe success. I'm interested though, just because, you know, it's interesting for us kind of fashion people being very excited about this, but, you know, Victoria, or I guess Alex as well, writing for, you know, a big kind of newspaper audience. Do you think your reader would be aware that there was a change at Gucci? Would they be interested? How do you communicate something like that?
I think, I don't know, I always kind of think your average luxury customer probably isn't really aware of changes coming in.
Yeah.
I think, you know, if you go to like a big department store in, I don't know, somewhere in America like Dallas or something, you know, if you look at a Balenciaga concession there, it's just all Lariat bags. And I don't think they've got a clue that Alex Wang's come in and changed everything. Or I don't think you're sort of the person who wants to go and buy a new handbag once a year or every other year is really aware of that. I think it's a kind of like a heightened fashion customer that has that sort of knowledge and is interested to that extent. I think from like a sort of a mass consumer point of view, but they obviously still want to look at a great product.
Yeah.
So I think it translates in that way, in that if the product's really good, then they'll react to it and it will, you know, get people back into the stores and back interested in that brand. But I think the kind of nuances of a new designer and those kind of changes, I do think it's not such a mass consumer thing, I think, anyway.
Don't you think the customer reacts more to the celebrity or the sort of high profile person wearing the clothes than the designer who's actually designed it?
Yeah, which I think is interesting to see how some designer, you know, most designers now are incredibly careful with who they let wear their clothes and how they kind of pick them, because they're aware that those women or men become the ambassadors of the house in a way that perhaps just the designer himself or herself used to be. But I think it'll be interesting to see who wears this and how it is worn, and because it is a very different proposition, and it's not red carpeting. You know, we're used to seeing in a Gucci Womenswear show, you're used to that kind of run of evening wear.
Yeah, when you can see the dresses that they're going to wear. There are a few in here, I think, that there's a few kind of red carpet things.
Alex, would you agree with that? That you think most of your average luxury shopper perhaps isn't aware? What's your take on it as well, Harriet? I think it's a really hard one, isn't it? Because we love a new appointment in fashion.
I think maybe people, there is an interest and people are aware, but it's how long you retain that knowledge, because there's so much information and names, and the brand name always needs to be much stronger. So it's just, how do you keep the interest in there? What's the value of keeping the interest? And how does it, strategize along in the long term?
It's interesting that you said the brand name always needs to dominate. Is there something in the fact that they did promote from within, and we're seeing a lot of these kind of like from the Salt Mines appointments? I think
it's interesting within the Caring Group, which has a very strong sort of sustainability program, which kind of really spreads into human resources and the talent that's within companies. And if there's somebody there that's kind of raring to go and has obviously proven themselves within the studio team, fantastic. Rather than also the economics of bringing in an outside designer plus probably usually a team is an extraordinary investment.
It does suggest though that the Gucci shopper would not be she or he isn't looking for this kind of big name to like bring her back to shop Gucci. I think there's this idea, I think it really, I'm just interested in this idea that, it's...
But they've never had a big name at Gucci.
Yeah, that's true actually, it's very true.
They've never been big names that they've brought in. Also, I think talking a little bit about would people be interested, I think from a news perspective, people are interested, but they're interested in the size of Gucci and the fact they're bringing in somebody new. It's not about it's not like Margiela where the story is that John Galliano's gone in and let's talk about John Galliano. When I wrote about the new designer being appointed to Gucci, the newspaper did want to cover it, but it was entirely angled as to Gucci makes X amount of money, Gucci is X amount of turnover for the Caring Group. Gucci's profits have been this, Gucci's losses have been that. It's around the label, and it is just what Harriet said, this idea that Gucci's bigger than the designers that are inside it. I think it's very different when you look at something like Dior that has this history of bringing in kind of headline designers to kind of marquee names. It's very different to that. The approach at Gucci has always been very different to that.
Why?
Just has.
But do you think there's a reason? Do you think it's...
Well, I think first of all, the big designer they had was Tom Ford, who was promoted internally, then became a star, and they wanted to get rid of their star designer. They didn't want a designer that was bigger than the brand, so then they appointed people internally.
That makes sense. Should we move on to Prada? Prada's an interesting one because there's that similar, I think it was so great what you said right at the start, Harriet, because some of the themes that you talked about, kind of like awkwardness and that's like naivety, they do kind of run across, but this was a very different collection to Gucci. But also I think, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, for me it was not what I was expecting, which obviously you can never expect anything with Prada, but also given that kind of, at the menswear there was that manifesto about sort of gender and we saw that very kind of black, very uniform based collection, and then to do something so girlish and so saccharine was kind of always that little twist that Mrs. Prada does so well.
But don't you think it's perfect for Hilary Clinton?
Maybe
there's her entire presidential wardrobe laid out.
Oh my god, I wish. Can you imagine?
Maybe minus the gloves.
And maybe without.
Made in red, white and blue.
Yes, so good, wouldn't it?
I don't know if she's allowed to wear Italian designers, but...
I don't think so.
Be good, wouldn't it, though? So this was a strong collection, we all seem to think.
Oh, I think definitely it's strong. And the colours are completely sort of unusual and juxtaposed. But I think it's still quite strict and a bit... that ugly chic thing that Muccia loves.
I was surprised because it felt very close to Miu Miu.
Yeah, it does.
But I wondered if there was... I mean, if you just saw these as 3 looks, I would look at that and presume it was a Miu Miu collection. You wouldn't look at it and necessarily presume it was a Prada collection, but I don't know if that's just...
I wonder what it would look like if you just took away all the gloves. Because, I mean, for the average, working woman, working girl, they would simply not be practical. So what are you going to put there in place, when you've got sleeves sort of ending half-mast?
But then I think it was a collection that was about the way it was put together, really, wasn't it? You know, a lot of it.
It's very classic Prada in a way. You know,
Yeah.
you've got that skirt shape, the boxy jacket, her love of gloves, but kind of put through a new Kramer filter. Because those colours are the things that will sell. You
Yeah.
know, the allure of a colour.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting also just to think about, I thought one of the things that a lot of people said about the men's show, which obviously it wasn't really a men's show because there was so much women's wear in it, was that it was a very safe collection in terms of commercially. You know, if you went into the store, it was things you wanted to see. And then this is very much kind of, I think there's a similar mentality, even though it's very different. That was all black, but this is also the kind of stuff that if you go into a luxury store, you do want to see, like a pretty pink dress, a nice pink jacket, you know, that kind of those easy colours that will sell to certain markets. Alex, you're a big Prada fan. Did you like it?
Yes, I did. It's interesting you said that about commerciality, because backstage Mrs. Prada said that she said to me that she wanted it was about the clothes that women want.
Yeah.
It was about that kind of Freudian idea of what women want. And when I was looking at it, I thought it was about kind of almost a mutated kind of femininity, like a kind of mutated Stepford wife kind of femininity. And then she talked about the fabric being genetically modified, and I was like, well, it's this kind of genetically modified femininity, which is hyper feminine but with something a little bit wrong about it, like, you know, the fact that Stepford wives only knew a limited vocabulary of words. It's almost like there's that kind of, there's something that's a little bit twisted and a little bit off about it. And I think that's why it works, that it has that sense of edge to it, that it's, even when it's really saccharine, if it's very saccharine, it's pushed to a point that makes it a little bit sick because it's so sweet. Which is, again, you know, it's kind of, it's the way that Prada always plays with those kind of things.
But that hyper-real effect, you know, see the pink coat, for example, it's sort of almost like looking at the absolutely perfect strawberry sundae,
Well, it's
but
that-
it's been genetically modified.
Yeah.
It's that kind of, it's that fabric, I think, which is like kind of a spongy, genuinely, when you touched it, it was genuinely spongy kind of double-faced jersey, and it took the colouring, she said she loved it because it took the colour incredibly well, and that you'd get these kind of flat planes of colour, which I think as you look through it, you're struck by that kind of uniformity, flatness of colour. It's almost like you don't realise that it's woven because of the way the colour is. And there's, you know, there are mixed in other bits, there are kind of molecular prints that look like a tweed, there's real tweed, there's printed tweed, there's all this kind of twisting of what's real, what's fake. And I really love the bags, which are kind of bags that are giving birth to another bag, a bit like kind of the alien out of Aliens, the little head that comes out. You can kind of see it, that there's this zipped kind of ambionic sack on the inside of these bags. So I thought it was very interesting that, again, it's those multiple levels of femininity, that idea of, you know, of the tropes of femininity, kind of mothering femininity, debutantes, all that kind of stuff.
She is interesting as well, because one of the things, as much as she's very interested in gender, and that obviously came across when she did those show notes at the men's wear, that was kind of this gender manifesto, I think she's also very interested in the idea of a woman's wardrobe and a man's wardrobe. I don't think she particularly plays with androgyny in a traditional sense, and I thought it was interesting to see her going from what she did when she kind of mixed men's and women's to doing something like this, where it is always very much about a woman's wardrobe. It's never about kind of blurring her men and her women, which I think is
I
interesting.
think sometimes she does. Last, for the cruise collection, there were men and women presented in exactly the same outfits. But I think this is very much a reaction to what she did in January.
Yeah.
It's, okay, so I do this uniform look where it's men and women, and then I present the most feminine
But I
possible
don't think
collection.
that was a uniform look. I think if you actually, one of the things I felt was interesting is the menswear was very distinct from the women's in that collection. It was all black, yeah, so it looked uniform, but the men were wearing suits, the women were wearing cocktail dresses with low backs and big bows on them. Like, they were very girlish. They were just black.
But there was a uniformity to the fabric.
Yeah.
It was a utilitarian uniform fabric, and there were even very subtle references, like the bows were made out of the epaulettes that had been taken out of the shirts and jackets and things like that.
But then the fact that she'd taken
But
men's things and turned them into...
taken men's things and turned them into women's, but this isn't about taking anything men's. This is a reaction to that, I feel, and a reaction to the previous cruise collection.
Yeah.
It's a reaction to having explored that blurring of wardrobes. Now this is absolutely for a woman, although I am going to buy a jacket and I'm going to get the gloves. Which is the other nice thing, I think. There is that thing. I always try and divorce myself from it at shows, and it doesn't, you know, it didn't impact what I wrote about the spring Prada show, even though I knew I couldn't wear any of it. But there's that amazing kind of, that thing that fashion's supposed to elicit, which is desire. There is that desire to acquire. And I don't always get it at a Prada show, and I don't judge whether it's a good or a bad show, but it's really great when you get it. It's really great when you see something you're like, that's exactly what I want to wear right now.
And I love the fur sort of epaulets, the shoulder straps, things that look detachable, or you can play it around with them.
Well, there was a lot of stuff like that, wasn't it? This kind of, you know those dolls where you put the paper flaps around them? It kind of was a bit like that, because there was like, you could like put on your little, you know, the little brooch, and you can put on the jacket and the gloves. It's like quite dress up, which I think is quite sweet. I am interested though in this idea of how sort of, we kept saying words like sweet and saccharine, and it's something we've talked about on Show Studio in other projects, but I'm interested in this kind of very girlish trend that we see a lot of, and this idea of things that are very, very, you know, sweet and pretty and quite infantile in some senses, like particularly, you know, you can see in some of these looks. I'm just interested why a luxury shopper, you know, a grown woman would embrace those kind of things, because we're seeing a lot of people doing that kind of thing. You can see it a lot in London, perhaps with designers, you know, someone like Ryan Lowe would be a good example, but also even with people like Simone Rocher. And why do you think that there is this kind of, because it's the opposite to that kind of Celine removed kind of immaculate slouchiness. You know, this is much more kind of ditzy and bitty.
But I think it's the way, like you said, it's the way that it's put together that gives that impression. I think, you know, you look at that look on the left there, and you take off the brooch and you put it with brogues, and it has a totally, you know, a different hair. It's a totally different feeling, and it's like what Hilary was saying. If they didn't have the gloves, it would feel completely different. I don't think it's not necessarily saccharine. I don't think a pink dress is necessarily about making a woman, you know, infantilizing a woman.
But I think a lot of this is I agree with you. Obviously, you could take it apart and slightly differently, but a lot of this is speaking to that trend. Definitely, it is about looking kind of pretty and.
Yeah, I think it's for a different customer than all the kind of the strict minimalism, which I think there is a reaction against now. And I think people are kind of getting a bit bored of it. A bit bored of just wearing like grey jumpers and black and white and navy things. I think there is that thing, you know, some women want that sort of kitsch element, and they want to look pretty, and they want those sort of sweet colours, and it's almost an easier sell in some ways, I think.
I think also perhaps there's the element too, if you talk about, you know, a plain grey sweater and a pair of black trousers and white t-shirt, there are a million places you could buy that at incredibly cheap prices. And if you aren't going to start paying, you know, vast amounts of money for a Prada suit or whoever it might be, I think you're looking for something that is different. And is immediately recognisable as something that isn't a basic. It isn't a readily available, accessible base. It is something designed and special, and it's got to look as if it is.
I
Not
think as well,
masquerade.
it's when you kind of, you know, we look at these, because the thing that actually struck me from this is, I think a woman in a suit is a really odd proposition. A woman in a skirt suit. You saying it was Hillary Clinton, is it because she's kind of the only person I see wearing it anymore?
And especially the pantsuit.
But I think if you look at them and then if you dissect it and think, well, one person's going to buy the jacket, it's not going to be sold as a two-piece. One person's going to buy the jacket, one person's going to buy the skirt or the trousers, and work it into those black trousers and those grey sweaters. I think immediately it becomes a different proposition. This is a very strong proposition, but I think a lot of people will interact with it on a consumer level. Will go in and see it, and I'm always surprised when I go into you know, when I go into a Prada shop and I'm like, oh, I never thought I could wear this, but I can. Like, I can wear this jacket.
I'm surprised when you go in, it always looks, because on the catwalk you can, I really thought that with the top stitching collection that they did, you know, on the catwalk you look at it a lot and you think, oh, that's really kind of innovative, or it looks really kind of, fashion, and then you see it in the store and it can also sometimes look very conservative, kind of luxury, like that top stitch, or that when you saw it hanging there with all the browns and the leathers, it looked very kind of, not conventional, but very traditional luxury Italian fashion. And it's interesting with those skirt suits that you mentioned, because I agree, I think people will buy them in different ways, but also it does mean if there's a very traditional, you know, moneyed woman who wants to buy something, she can go in and buy a skirt suit, which isn't a fashion item, but will kind of speak to that conservative luxury shopper who wants something really, really beautiful.
It's being able to have that double speak between commerce and a fashion statement. I think that's actually something that Prada's been focusing on, the idea of presenting a catwalk show that has a dual reality as a fashion statement and as a commercial thing.
And is that, going back to Gucci, is that part of the success of that collection, do you think?
I think with Prada, I think that they have their eye on the economics, and I think specifically looking at their menswear offering, which I know is separate to this, but their menswear, the women's wear was making profits and losses across different areas in the world, and the menswear made a profit everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Universally made a profit, and if you look at those menswear collections, the thing that I'm struck by is that their catwalk proposition could easily be worn by a normal guy that isn't really interested in fashion, but at the same time, for somebody that wants to wear a full catwalk look, there's that catwalk impact as well. So it's the idea of one thing doing two jobs and not really needing to have an enormous commercial offering because your catwalk stuff isn't going to sell.
And I think the best, when people do that well, it's not that there's, you know, some items for the commercial collection, some items for the, it's when it's when individual items can be worn in both different contexts. I think that's what makes it really interesting.
The other thing that's fascinating here is just the colour palette, because you look at it and you think, oh, cherry blossom, it's spring. You know, this is a very spring, and the emphasis on pretty, although it's pretty through, you know, through a different angle. But when that reaches the stores in July, it's going to look very fresh.
Yeah.
Rather than those heavy greys, navies, blacks, ombres that we normally associate
I think as well
with autumn.
it's that kind of awareness of a global market as well, and awareness of that this is going, you know, the southern hemisphere is incredibly important, and that's their summer. So it's that kind of breaking free of sort of European ideas of seasons.
I think the colours are just joyous is absolutely the right word, because you look and you feel quite happy and uplifted looking at these clothes. They look fun.
I also think it's interesting that it's a collection that is it does so well online. Like, you look at the catwalk looks and they work in a way that, you know, that was one of the things with the Gucci collection, I think, because a lot of it was about kind of slouch. Actually, in some of the pictures, it doesn't come across that well. Like some of the skirts, the way they're hanging or the way they've kind of become caught between the legs, they don't look that flattering. Whereas this, it's like, it was almost made to be flat in that sense. Which is interesting, given that Prada don't have the kind of the best relationship with e-retail. You know, they're not.
They don't sell their clothes.
Exactly. Which is what's really interesting about it, because I think that it's obviously created with that sense of kind of flatness, but then maybe it is just so the catwalk images go everywhere, but not necessarily
the clothes.
Yeah, the clothes. I think it's odd when you see
Instagram.
people do that really, really well, but then they don't follow through with the sale. But then maybe it is about whetting appetite for those accessories, as Alex says. Who else should we talk about? Harriet, you mentioned Bottega. Should we have a look at,
Let's have a look at
that, because you liked that? There's a lot to discuss. And now this again is very different, perhaps more in line with what we were looking at Gucci. What was it? Tell us more about what struck your fancy.
I just like the simplicity of it, actually. You know, it's very easy, and those gorgeous trousers and blouses, which are a current theme everywhere.
Yeah.
I just think Thomas Mayer's just got a fantastic handle of fabric and detail.
And it's so, I think it's interesting because there's a real precision with Bottega, but then there was a real, you said ease. This felt there was a lightness of touch, I think, with this that was nice. Was this something that impressed others? Alex, did you like it?
I did. I mean, for me it was interesting because I looked at it and I immediately related it to the menswear that they did in January, which was about kind of creative dressing and the way that artists dressed, and I was sort of like, oh well, these are the women that are buying the art, and they're wearing their Kusama and their Rothkos, and you know, and I thought it was being very clever and figuring out what it was all about. And then I read the show notes and it was nothing to do with that, but I feel like
maybe it was, he just hadn't realised.
But I think you look at it and you know, Bottega's interesting as a collection because you can often find that thread of narrative that's maybe your own narrative rather than something that Thomas Mayer is necessarily going to sort of own up to thinking about. I think really it's very interesting because I think what he does is incredibly influential, but in a very sly way. It's not the way that Prada's influential, but you go and look at other people's collections and they're using decoration in the way that he's using decoration. You know, they're using needle punch, which I think he was one of the first not one of the first people ever to use, but he really revived it and used it consistently. You know, the idea of hand painting things, and that really that idea of sort of time and work that isn't blingingly obvious, but this idea of clothes that are really crafted, and that being a kind of luxury, the luxury of time, the fact that they can't make a huge number of those woven leather bags, you know, they can't make a huge number of these dresses. It's that kind of sort of exclusivity and a sort of quiet luxury, and I think really that's what he represents, and you see a lot of other labels referencing that.
Why are other people referencing it?
Because it makes a lot of money.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to be sort of the person being like, oh, it makes loads of money, they're not making any money, they're changing it because they've no money. But, you know, it's a business, fashion is a business. Saint Laurent makes the most profit in Kering Group and that have the most impressive figures, and the next one is Bottega. And I think those are the two where you can see their
But they're
influence.
such opposite propositions. Saint Laurent is not remotely about quiet luxury or you know, the discreet or time, whereas Bottega is absolutely about that. And I'm just interested in, is that two distinct consumers? Which one has the kind of, you know, the staying power? You know, why? It's just two very, very different things. And I know
It's two different types of luxury.
Yeah.
But
it
it's
means
very
they've got to-
ageless, isn't it? It's a very ageless proposition, and it's.
But in a weird way, I've you know, Saint Laurent apparently sells very well to women over 50.
I think it does in store.
But it means that they've got two, you know, kind of stabs at the market, you know, at two very different sectors.
Yeah.
You know, with different impulses to buy, or, you know, different wants and needs, and they've cornered
Yeah, the
two
two.
very,
I'm
you
interested
know,
in which one's having more
good
influence
ones.
on the luxury market, because it's interesting what you talked about, kind of like Thomas Meyer's influence as a designer, but I did feel like there was a while where everyone was trying to do this kind of label, this luxury and discreet, and you know, it's our third roundup. On the flip side to that, everyone is also talking about this kind of consistent influence of Saint Laurent, and I'm just interested in kind of, it's such a kind of cliched future of luxury, but like where it's going to go, you know, which model other houses are going to follow. Are we going to see Gucci going more for this, or are we going to see them going more for the Saint Laurent model, which is the most sustainable, which is the...
Isn't they each got to scratch out their own territory?
Yeah.
I don't
You
think
know,
there
and
is going to be.
define it.
I don't think there is going to
Yeah.
be. And I
On
actually
one
think, in a
side.
way, what Gucci's trying to do is something almost go a third way, which, as Hilary said, is this whole idea of you
diversity.
can't. Yeah, exactly. You don't want to go after one customer that you're already having success with. Maybe go for something different, which is, you know, there isn't anything remotely level entry about what Bottega does.
No.
No.
Saint Laurent is very expensive. Gucci reintroducing the logo and reviving entry-level logo products as they're launching beauty as well. Well, beauty launched last year, I think, but this year is when they're going to really push it. You know, I think that's actually kind of, that's the third way, which is something that's much more mass market.
And when Alex mentioned logo, think of Versace with great big, you know, Versace. You know, just the way, you know, Gianni used to do it.
Yeah. Should we look at Versace?
And they're making money as well.
Oh God, Alex, you're like our financial correspondent.
It's really weird, I think, now.
Logo mania.
Well, I was kind of talking to somebody about the economics of fashion, and just like, I think now because so many companies are public and you have access to these things,
There's so much
it's
at
not
stake.
enough just to say, oh, they're selling lots of clothes. What you have to say is they're selling lots of clothes, and their sales last year went up 7%. That's Moschino as an example. You want to be able to back it up with hard economic fact. It's not enough to just conjecture that you think they're probably selling more. And the thing that's amazing is when you actually look at the figures and see things like, you know, that Saint Laurent is now selling twice as, you know, its revenue is twice what it was when Eddie started. The fact that Moschino, in the first year of Jeremy Scott, has risen from 60% to 65% of the entire AFA group's profits. That Moschino went up 7%. That Philosophy to Alberto Ferretti's revenue went down 38%. I'm really shocked when I see these figures, and you know, Prada's profits were down, I think, 25%.
It's a weird taboo in fashion journalism where people, like, it's very rare that you read a show review that does, you're right, it's always this kind
I
of
don't.
like this
It's not
nod
so
to
much for
it.
me. It's not so much a show review, unless it's very obviously impacting the clothes that you're seeing. But certainly, if I'm writing a brand profile or something like that, there's no way I couldn't mention if they're readily available, the economics, or trying to find
you
out
need
the
to.
economics.
I think
of it.
everybody wants to know about that side
Yeah.
of the business, but I think you have to be very careful with the figures because you're looking at. Not that many companies release pure profit. They'll talk about turnover and they'll talk about revenue. Now, obviously, if your clothes are more expensive, there's more revenue.
Yeah.
So your percentage increase can actually be quite an opaque figure, really.
Yeah, that's actually very true.
And then also when they have beauty and they talk about profit, and you're like, okay, so what profit is coming? Or they'll talk about their clothes sales going up and the group's profits going up. But actually what it means is we have very expensive clothes and we're selling very expensive clothes, but we're actually making lots of profit from the new perfume that we launched. But I feel like it's so many more people have a grasp on that now, and so many more fashion journalists are interested in
I think
it.
you have to.
Yeah.
I think it's almost after the economic crisis.
Yeah,
now
of
you
course.
want a degree of transparency. You want to know what's going on, and you don't just trust somebody telling you they're making lots of money because they could be, fashion Bernard Madoff. You never know.
And I think also it's that sort of thing, we're all, looking at money and investments. We're more aware of the different products out there for our own personal finances as well.
Yeah.
I just think that there's a sort of knowledge there that needs a constant feed.
Yeah, I think you're really right.
Yeah.
I think people often talk about the consumer being more savvy. It's
Yeah.
like they know more
They
about
are.
fashion, but I think people always relate that to design. They're like, oh, they know what everyone's doing, but actually, I think it is more about the finances. They know where they can get a bargain, what's worth
Yeah.
what.
I think also it's interesting when you think, when you put the idea of the rise of haute couture into that, the fact that more people are buying haute couture now, it's almost because they know that they're getting their money's worth if they're buying couture. It's more expensive, but it's, no one's making a profit off it. You're actually getting concentrated work.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Versace collection. Alex, give us the numbers before we begin.
I don't know the numbers actually on this. I know that I think Versace's just been valued at €1 billion, I think, because of the investment, because they've sold 20% of the house.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, again, to see that kind of push of what Versace represents in the marketplace. But with this collection, actually, what Donatella was talking about, what she wanted to propose when I saw her before the show, and she said that because of the way the fashion calendar fell this time, Versace was showing after the Oscars. And that's why there's a focus on day wear, because for her, she said the catwalk for evening wear is the Oscars. It's about dressing those people. And
Which
normally,
is Harriet's point about celebrity and
Yeah.
we were talking about.
well, they've done it on a Saturday and have flown the stuff out to get to the Oscars on the Sunday. But this time it was a focus on day wear. And also she felt that, she said that she felt atelier was where you really go for the evening wear. That it's about that couture. If people want evening wear, they'll buy couture.
Yeah.
And so this was much more about focus on Versace day wear, focus on the tailoring of Versace, and also on this idea of
day wear.
digital.
Yeah, so expand.
But no, there is at the start. There's, it is suiting, which again I question how many women actually wear a suit on a daily basis. But Hilary Clinton, she dresses.
No,
Hillary
but I love
Clinton.
that idea of day wear. I think it's funny that we look at things and we're like, oh, it's very day wear heavy, and then we were talking yesterday about why Marcus Almeida have been so successful, and the kind of the main thing we all kind of just landed on was because they make actual day wear,
But I
not
think,
day wear that's a skirt
we're
suit.
talking from a fashion creative industries perspective. I worked in an investment bank for 6 years. You had to wear a suit. You, as a man,
Wouldn't
you
you
had
call
to
that
wear a suit.
workwear, not day wear?
But it's what I wore every day.
Yeah.
And a tie.
What? Yeah, tie, jacket, full shebang. And the women had to wear
They wear
a
suits.
proper suit.
Yeah.
Everyone,
Yeah,
you had
still
to wear
very
And you're
a suit.
normally in a
conservative.
monotone colour.
You had to wear a suit jacket to cross the
Yeah.
banking hall.
Yeah.
Like, it's what you had to do. And I think, if you come into the city at, creative industry starting time is 10 o'clock. Seeing commuters at that time is very different to seeing commuters at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
going into the
But
city.
then it's hard because no high fashion brands are really, I don't think, that successfully catering to what those kind of workers have to wear. Like, I have female friends who are baristas. Like, there's the requirements on what they can wear are so strict that you actually do just end up going to, getting like a suit from a suit coat. Yeah, because actually to try and wear anything with a degree of creativity, you would just be looked at like you were bonkers.
But don't a lot of people use women on the continent anyway wear Hugo Boss because they can get that
Yes, yeah.
tailored, smart,
timeless.
Discreet, timeless, beautifully made,
Yeah.
good quality.
And it doesn't worry anybody. If you're doing
Yeah.
a big client presentation, you don't want items that are shouting to you.
Yeah,
that much,
exactly.
Well, I think the other thing is we are looking here at a very exaggerated version. We're looking at the catwalk version of that, and obviously there's a commercial collection to back it up.
Yeah.
And Donatella said, you know, she sells a lot of tailoring. Versace sells a lot of tailoring. The menswear had a focus on tailoring. This had a focus on tailoring, and it was about also this engagement with the digital age, which is something that's interesting, and it's something that she's been talking a lot about through her various collections.
Didn't she take her bow in a pinstripe?
She did,
Trouser
a
suit,
pinstripe,
yeah.
pinstripe trouser
Or
suit.
pantsuit?
Yeah.
Could you love it? I love how excited you are.
Oh no, it's only because Hillary Clinton and sort of
True.
running for president, and there's so many, collections are doing kind of the Hillary Clinton
They're all
70s
behind her.
throwback wardrobe. It's bizarre.
But I mean, with this, there's the sort of digital age stuff was. For me, it was. I wonder if we're going to look back at it in the way that we look back on, that sort of Gianni Versace catsuit covered in Vogue covers, and it's a bit gimmicky. And I wonder if we're going to look back on hashtags and @ symbols and things like that on a Versace dress and think, oh, that's so. That's so what someone would do in 2015. Look back on it in 10 years' time and be like.
But it feels like it's like a
naff.
parody of 2015. Do you know what I mean?
I think, as well, it's about catching the moment of the time, but the trouble with catching a particular moment is it dates very quickly.
But then high fashion wants everything to date because then they'll buy something new next season. So in a way, it's like perfect.
But this is almost out of date before it's gone on sale,
Yeah.
isn't it? There's a word for that, but I can't think what it is.
You said something interesting to me, Alex, when we first talked about it, which was this idea that she was looking at how someone would look at Versace if they were Googling it and the codes that they would see purely based on the kind of haphazard imagery that would pop up on a Google image search rather than actually what's in the realities of what's in the archive.
Well, I think also it's looking at someone else's view of Versace. I think, Anthony Vaccarello designs Versus. I think there's a youth to this collection that is, and there are references to what Anthony does, but I think it's very much about trying to get into the mindset of young designers looking at Versace and thinking about it. Donatella's design team there are very young as well, so it's trying to get a sense of that joy and what other people are enthusiastic about, and in a sense, looking at your own work with fresh eyes. And not thinking, oh well, I did that, so I did that 10 years ago, so it's worthless. It's kind of looking at it and looking at the value of your own past.
Do you think also, Alex, there's a sense, or to a slight degree, that insufficient time has passed that she can look back and almost reinvent the Gianni Versace years?
Yeah. I think there's
With
this,
a digital sort of overlay, if you like.
I think as well there's that idea that it's enough time has passed for that to feel relevant again. And I think as well, talk about the economics again, is this idea of someone investing in the house of Versace. What you've really got to do is be like, okay, so this is what we stand for in the marketplace. This is, you've bought into us, this is what we stand for, this is what we can do that nobody else can do. This is our place in the market.
DNA.
And I think, yeah, exactly. It's very much about emphasising that, about looking back at the heritage, reminding people what they did that was great and how it can still be great. That whole idea of I don't like talking about the codes of the house, but it is about that,
Yeah.
They
So,
talk about the Greek key, that kind of thing.
So much so. It's that sort of past, present, future. You sandwich it in one. I think that's very much about this
Triple-decker.
collection.
Like a triple-decker sandwich, yeah.
You feeling peckish? Well, a lot of the things that we've talked about, this idea of modernity and sort of reinterpreting the codes of what something stood for, I think it does kind of lead us quite nicely to Moschino, just because you see recoiled there. Because there is this kind of, I think, very I think Jeremy Scott has interpreted quite liberally what Moschino is about, and I think what's so interesting now is when I speak to, often we do panels where we get students in and we ask them what they think, and they often talk about Moschino and they're like, well, Moschino is all about gimmicks, it's all about fun, it's all about silliness, and I think that's very, very different to how someone maybe sort of 20, 30 years older would even 10 years older would interpret Moschino. I think people of a certain generation assume Moschino is quite political, whereas a younger generation is completely removed from that. To them, the codes of the house is silliness, which is something that Jeremy Scott has kind of written into it. What do we think of what he does there? Victoria, do you like it? That's that sound.
Wouldn't say like, but I think it's clever what he's done.
Yeah.
I mean, it's selling, so you can't really. And if he's got a new generation to get into it and think it's fun and think it's cool and want to buy like a £90 t-shirt with, you know, Moschino, whatever it says on it, I think that he's kind of cracked it a bit. And it's that sort of Instagram generation that want to take a picture of themselves and wear something that stands out and that is fun. And it's different than what you can get elsewhere on a catwalk. Maybe that's not a good thing, but he's doing something right. Kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe we're not the audience for it.
Yeah,
It's something new.
I do think it's interesting to see. I mean, it's interesting and scary at the same time to see a really luxury house going for that really young market and going, okay, you know, maybe they will just buy the iPhone cases and the t-shirts, kind of as he implied, but you know, they'll grow up with us and they'll be because you know, you're not really seeing that with that many other houses, just really trying to get them while they're really young.
Yeah.
And they are the next, you know, people often talk about Generation Z having like, you know, they do have a disposable income and they want to buy stuff and they're into luxury, and there's no one it's really hard, I think, to kind of target a luxury market while also grabbing those people. Perhaps it's something that Saint Laurent is doing a little bit of, but this is so clearly doing it.
And also there's some amazing, you know, down-fill jackets and coats and vests, which
totally
just
on the
completely
money.
fun.
Yeah.
Après-ski or, you know, on the streets or wherever. I mean, definitely you would wear them because they're, again, cheerful and joyous and bright. I mean, you may not wear sort of all 3 or 4 bits together at the same time, but certainly one of them.
Do you like it, Harriet? What's your take on
I
it?
kind of really admire what he's done. I think, you know,
Yeah.
there's huge energy in there, and there's sort of how Moschino as a brand has kind of reappeared on the radar. It's very likeable.
Yeah.
It really is.
It was interesting. I spoke to some people who I didn't go to the show. I spoke to people who went to the show, and they kind of said, like, no matter kind of what you feel, you do come away vaguely uplifted from it. And I think,
Yeah, it's fun.
why do you think the profits have increased, Alex?
They offer it for sale. They offer a capsule for sale straight away after each show. And a retailer told me that they do 75% of their Moschino sales from that in the first week.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I think it's very much about that kind of fast food mentality of something that's kind of easily consumed, readily available. It's at the right price point. You know, they've kind of lowered the prices to make it more accessible, and you know that, and it relies a lot on things like prints and on quite easy clothes that are very easy to sort of manufacture and easy for people to consume. You know, it's and that all makes sense. It's almost like what Harriet was saying about profitability, and I'd be quite interested to see that, you know, the revenues have gone up. I'd be quite interested to see if the profits have gone up and to what degree the profits have gone up, because these are relatively simple clothes.
Are there sales, you know, in that first week or so after the catwalk show? Are they mainly in Asia or Russia?
These retailers that I've spoken to are British-based retailers.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. They are an online retailer, so I'm not sure what percentage obviously is going abroad and things like that, but they're a UK-based, and they're not. It's a company called Money à Frères. I don't know if you know that. They're, but they say 75% of their sales come from there.
It's really interesting, that buy it now.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
buy it now, see it, buy it now.
Yeah.
Fascinating to kind of have the infrastructure and the logistics to actually make that happen.
Well, it's going to have to happen. I think everyone's going to have to do it at some point. I think everyone will work out their own way to do it. Maybe it will be this drip feed that I think most people who are starting it are doing. You know, they'll do like the accessories and stuff. But I think, you know, some people will skip a season, come back. It's not. I don't think it can continue with this bizarre 6 months.
But it's not bizarre. I find it quite unpleasant to talk about things being immediately available. It really hampers people's creativity because it means you have to commit. You know, I talked with Tom Ford about it a bit, and we were talking about the week before the collection. He's like, that's the most important time. That's the time when, you know, everything can change the week before the collection. That's when you're deciding if it's right.
But you will have that. I think you would, of course, you would have that.
But you can't change it. You won't be able to change it if it's all been manufactured. You can't change.
But you
the
would just
clothes.
design it much earlier. You wouldn't design it a week before the show. You would design it.
But you don't design it the week before the show. But you try and react to what's happening. You know, the stories of, you know, V&A throwing out her whole collection and remaking it in the 30s. You know, it's I feel like fashion designers have to be reactive to a moment, and to take that away, you're emasculating them. It's like you're castrating a designer to say, well, you have to commit to this. And I think you see these collections that are creatively castrated because the design, you know, something like, I'll be completely politically incorrect, you know, something like Burberry, you look at that and they've committed to that so far ahead that things can be manufactured. It really sucks some of the joy out of things.
So what's the answer then? Because do you think that
people will have to just fucking wait? I think people need to stop being so impatient. You order haute couture, you don't get it straight away. Those are the richest people in the world. They're willing to wait. You need to make clothes that people are willing to wait for. And maybe it's doing
Is that
things,
part of the problem then?
but maybe it's doing things like Celine does, where they don't show their pre-collections until the stuff actually hits the shop.
Yeah.
Which they say is to stop copying, but I also think it's to stop people getting tired of them.
Yeah.
You know, I personally think it's going to go two ways simultaneously. I think more people will follow the Moschino model and the Burberry model of offering things for sale immediately after the show. And I think other people will retreat. I think it will take one or two very powerful people to say, no, we're not doing this anymore. We're not going to do pre-collections. We're not going to show this. You know, the same way that, if we're referencing history, the same way that Balenciaga and Givenchy decided to show their collections after everybody else in the 50s. I think somebody powerful will do that because they will understand that will be a new type of luxury. It's pulling back from all this mass availability and offering something that feels exclusive again. That's what I feel.
And I think the problem too with having stuff ready like the next day or within hours or a week makes it that much more possible for high street chains to get in on the look. So once
it's
again,
so blatant as well. Like
there's a sort of flooding, there's a deluge, if you like. So by the time the season actually rolls around, it's like
You've seen it.
Do you get those really odd emails? I get very odd emails from various people that actually have as the subject line in the email catwalk copy.
Yeah, exactly.
And they show literally a skirt, and then they'll be like, "Here's the copy that's £15."
Yeah.
And I'm like, when did it become? I think
Blatant.
tweeted. When did it become
Blatant.
acceptable to use language like copy and for it to be a good thing for you to say, "Oh, we've copied this, isn't it great?"
Yeah.
And I see stuff like, you know, there was a Mary dress that had been completely blatantly copied, and it's a print on a jersey dress. I'm like, it's like you photocopied the dress and have used it again. But that is the concern, and people, I think it used to be really isolated. I don't know if everyone else remembers that Marc Jacobs skirt. There was a big furore over in like 2003 that Topshop had done a skirt that was almost identical to a Marc Jacobs skirt in like June after Marc had shown it in February. And now it's just, and then there was absolute outrage, and now it's just absolute. You know, if you waited till June,
It's common
you've
practice.
missed something. Like you've missed something by it not being out by the end of March.
Yeah. But do you think that's not going to be regulated? Is it? There's no way to.
I think intellectual property right on design is
Yeah.
really difficult because you need to have, you know, if you've got 12 points of difference, you're okay.
There's a really good blog called The Fashion Law that talks a lot about, I don't know if you've seen this, that talks a lot about
It's really good.
that kind of infringement and how difficult it is to pursue it, and how different people are protecting their intellectual copyright and how much people, but I think actually it's much more difficult now to protect it than it used to be.
Yeah.
I think it's getting more and more difficult because also people are cleverer and cleverer.
It's scary though, isn't it? There's a lot of people we haven't talked about. We haven't talked at all about Armani. We haven't talked about Fendi.
I haven't talked about Pucci,
We haven't talked about Pucci.
which is interesting because he's gone.
Yes.
He's gone.
yes.
His swan song.
Tell us about, because everyone reacted very well to this collection. They said it was like an absolutely lovely celebration. They said,
I thought it was rubbish.
tell us about that.
But what I think it was, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that whatever I think of Peter Dundas as a designer, I think he used to be much stronger and now he's much weaker. He undoubtedly has moved Pucci from being a print house into being a fashion house. I think that's really his important legacy, is he's the only designer that's worked at Pucci since Pucci who's actually transformed it into a fashion house. And there's so much in this collection that has absolutely no print.
Why did you think it was rubbish?
Just was. How many times have I seen him do these dresses? A million. How many times have I seen other people do most of these clothes? A million. I think it's really lazy design, which is fine. I don't think Pucci customers demand too much. I don't think the press demands too much. We don't expect the earth to move. it's like he's designing dresses and being like, okay, have we got enough for a show yet? Can we go out and have a party?
Yeah.
Like which is fine, because I think the Pucci girls are just like, oh, let's just go and get a dress and go out and party.
But also the reality is that, you know, he's probably signed his contract
Yes, yeah, exactly.
quite a while before this, so
Yes, he's checked out before.
Yeah.
he wants to obviously leave on a good note.
Yeah.
But it's like, I mean, all of those shapes and designs, you know, perhaps sort of 2 seasons ago it would have been turquoise, and then a couple of seasons
Yeah.
before that.
Yeah, it's
would
very
be
one note. It's
pink.
just the same
And now,
thing.
oh, let's do red, black, and white. You know, so everything gets chucked in the blender with a different dye, and
I think it's a little bit sad, because at one point I do remember going to a Pucci show when he first started to show those really long dresses and thinking, oh, this is amazing and it's beautiful, and it's amazing to see someone reinterpreting kind of the Pucci print as an embroidery, and I actually think what he did during his tenure at the house is the important thing. When you can look at this collection, nobody could have done this before he went there, and whereas now it's broadened Pucci into this fashion house that can offer things that aren't print. I'm not sure how much people still go to Pucci for print, and the guy they've brought in to do it is Massimiliano Gionetti. I hope he's called that. Is a print specialist. So, and he's also kind of a sportswear print specialist. So I think it's interesting to see that they're again going for a contrast to the previous creative director. They want something different.
But still, the offer for Pucci is very small compared to other houses. I mean, you have swimwear, you have the tie-up with all of our brand, but it's actually very small.
And it's print based.
Yeah.
And what do we think for the future for Peter Dendis? Does the new appointment make sense? What do you not think? You seem to think he's a talented designer.
Yeah, well, he's come from Cavalli and he's going back to Cavalli.
Yeah.
I think it will be interesting to see what he does there that's different.
Yeah,
Because
and
that's
this is like that could be Cavalli.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
So it's
well, sexy, you know. That's, I mean, that's I think probably one of his key strengths.
But I do think if you can carve yourself out as a designer that does that very well, which is what's I think so interesting about his career and his trajectory, and as Alex said, the kind of, you know, where he's been is you can't imagine anyone else who could have done that job in the sense, because most, you know, I think you kind of saw it a little bit with all the discussions that were around Gucci, and obviously it's gone in a very different direction. People who can do kind of beautiful, sexy dressing really, really well. It's quite a niche set of designers who focus on that angle. And he really owns it. Did other people have a more positive view of this collection?
A lot of people did like it, like you said.
Yeah. I think people thought it was quite celebratory. And tell me, we've missed a few people. We haven't talked about Marnie, we haven't talked about Dolce & Gabbana. Did we like the Dolce & Gabbana ode to the mother?
Extraordinary.
I just felt to see that poor baby, his like head flopping around. Very strange.
yeah. But I think in light of his comments recently, it kind of looks a bit different now, doesn't it? When you
Yeah.
look back after his
And also,
IVF.
some of the models didn't look old enough to be mothers.
There was, I think one of them was actually good, and it was because I was kind of making a crack about a model with a borrowed baby, and it was actually her baby, so that kind of proved me wrong. It was the girl who was the pregnant bride at Chanel last year, and
Yeah.
this is her with her little bambino. But I mean, it's the thing that I just found it very interesting, different people's interpretations, because I said something about, you know, I think it's 4/5 of Italian adults between the ages of 18 and 29 still live at home with their parents.
Yeah.
And then someone else commented to me that Italy has the lowest birth rate in Europe. So it's that it's you can look at it in two very different ways. You can look at it as this kind of celebration, but also I'm like, should you be celebrating a woman as a mother?
Yeah.
Doesn't it feel a little bit retrograde to be like, look at,
But
you
then
know,
they celebrate-
and a mother is the most wonderful thing you
Yeah.
can be. It's very that Dior thing of, you know, the war's over, get back in the kitchen and get, you know, birthing some babies.
Yeah.
It felt to me it was that very sort of retrograde, and I know they wanted it to be a celebration of womanhood, and that's great, but to me it felt very one-dimensional.
Womanhood is
Yeah.
more than motherhood now, isn't it?
Exactly.
I think
Yeah.
it's that idea that there's that. There's a really good piece in the New Yorker recently about it, where it was like even though we've kind of got to a point where we accept that, you know, women can you know, have all these amazing jobs, all these amazing opportunities, there is still this idea that if you do not marry someone, or you haven't had a child, that kind of, you know, the crowning jewel of your life wasn't quite achieved. And I do think that is still a mentality, you know, that you would never choose to be in a position where where you're like that, and this kind of reinforces that.
There's
But
not
there
much
is
here for
nowhere.
Hillary Clinton.
No, there's not much
No.
over Hillary Clinton. We should have a Hillary monitor. Where if she'd wear it, it's a good
Hillary
collection.
board.
If she wouldn't.
But there is quite a lot of day wear and sort of more sensitive cocktail dresses, tailoring. So it wasn't, just entirely woman, as a birthing phenomena,
But I feel it's very much, for me, I go and I see these Dolce shows, and they're a wonderful production, and sometimes I like them and sometimes I don't, but the clothes never really stray too far from...
Yeah.
Sometimes it is like you're seeing a girl's world template, that someone's scribbling a different, maybe it's a mother, maybe it's a scene from Spain, maybe it's a bit of Sicily. Like, it's something different within this kind of boom, boom, boom. Here's 72 silhouettes, and here's a finale of, what are they going to be in? Matador pants? Are they going to be, are they going to be in capes? Are they going to be in
Corsets,
crowns,
yeah.
corsets?
tiaras.
Exactly.
Milkmaid dresses,
always.
It's, and I think almost it epitomises the problem that you sometimes have with Milan, that you feel like you go to the same place and you see the same show,
Yeah.
and to see everybody else trying to do something new,
Yeah.
then
I think that's
That's a
why.
really interesting point in the
Yeah.
context of the
I think
shows.
in the context,
Yeah.
I think if they'd done this last season, people
Yeah.
probably actually found it even more fun. But I think this season, it didn't stand up because other people were doing stuff that was new. You could kind of, when you go from a Gucci show to this last season, it's kind
well, I
of
think it was that people had really broken with that status quo. That's
Yeah.
and there was an excitement, and it was weird to go and be excited by things
Yeah.
because there were shows
But
that you
what
really
could they
wanted to see.
do? I think that's the problem.
It's interesting because they were the first to kind of really play heavily with digital media and sort of have, Twitter tags and all the rest of it, and the signage and the actual catwalk. But and they played that to the max. But it's a good formula.
But it's innovation that's not genuine innovation. It's innovation on the surface. Playing into all these new channels, as you say, the kind of the hashtags, the digital strategy. But when it
was innovative when they first did it, actually.
Yeah,
but
it
now
was.
now
It
it's
was quite
become by
breakthrough.
rote.
Yeah.
It's just, but it's almost like I think it would be really great if they took themselves out of their comfort zone a little bit. I think it's fine, and they obviously know that has a great commercial basis.
Tell us about their numbers. Go.
I don't think I know their numbers.
Do you know that one?
No, they're not publicly
They're not
offered.
public.
I don't
No.
think. Dolce.
Consistently like a bestseller, because those dresses don't really change that much, and people always want those dresses.
Yeah.
You know what you're going to get.
But I think they could, do something different. They could shake it up. They could,
I'll tell you one thing different about this collection. No leopard print.
That's true.
Not an ounce.
maybe that's why I didn't like it as much. I want a full-on Betlin border at the end, and then I'd be happy.
So it seems from our discussions that it was a strong Milan. It was a Milan that got us exciting. What does it say for the future of Milan? Do you think we are seeing attempts in people? Much has been made of Armani kind of lending its show space to young designers. Are we going to see Milan as a place where we go for comment on design, and rather than just this kind of obsession with kind of the big businesses? How's Milan going to change? Is it going to change, or is this just a kind of a weird season because there was change in the air?
I think perhaps people might watch and wait and see what happened at Gucci, for example. See how well the figures stack up after that collection. Once things start going into the stores. And I think also the fact that quite a few designers are getting older with each season, that's going to impact too upon.
I think over like the next 10 years or something,
Yeah.
we're
The
going to
legacy.
see. I think
10
we're going to
years
see
is
a
so
lot
interesting.
a lot of changes. See whether people are changing, new people going into houses and things, because we've sort of seen the switch-arounds that you can see. We saw which are actually switch-arounds we saw maybe, I guess, 10 years ago. A lot of these houses, again, had a shake-up. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether these are permanent appointments, whether these are interim appointments, whether it's all going to upheave again in another few years and then settle down. But for me, it's really nice to go to Milan and be really excited to see. And genuinely, not just to be excited, but to not know what people are going to do. That's a really exciting thing.
To be surprised.
Yes.
Yeah.
What a nice note to end on. A note of curiosity and surprise. And I feel like we should give them all a clap for doing, for giving us so much food for discussion. And we can give Hillary Clinton a clap while we're at it as well. Thanks, guys.